Even though the pandemic isn't completely behind us, travel is expected to continue surging into the new year.
The TSA says that air travel is up by nearly double from a year ago.
Regional airlines say they're already experiencing a pilot shortage, and that could affect the major airlines since they hire from the regionals.
We have almost 100 airplanes effectively grounded right now. We have to have a higher supply of pilots, and we just don't have enough today.
And all of us travelers could potentially feel the effects by seeing fewer flight options and even higher ticket prices. Now, all of these ripple effects have brought a controversial 2013 airline regulation back into focus. It's called the 1,500-hour rule. So what is it, and why is it relevant today? I had to jump back more than a decade to find the answers.
On an ice-cold night, the flaming wreckage of Continental Flight 3407.
In 2009, a regional plane stalled in the air and then crashed into a house, killing 50 people outside of Buffalo, New York. Investigators later found that the captain's poor training was at fault. Congress began searching for solutions to prevent future pilot errors.
We do need to make sure there's a standard of safety for every American.
And one of its proposed reforms was the 1,500-hour rule. The nickname came from the fact that it would require aspiring pilots in the US, including co-pilots, to have 1,500 hours of prior flight experience before taking the controls of a passenger or cargo plane. That is a 6-fold increase from the previous minimum of 250 hours. As WSJ reported at the time, airline officials warned that the rule would increase costs for pilot training, which would aggravate the already dwindling supply of commercial aviators, leaving smaller airlines understaffed and smaller cities without essential air services. But Congress was undeterred.
We've got to fix these problems, and it's going to take both more hours and better quality, and I support any efforts that'll get us there.
At the order of Congress, the Federal Aviation Administration implemented the 1,500-hour rule in 2013. Even though there are some exceptions to the 1,500-hour rule for pilots with certain kinds of degrees or training, the requirements are still high compared to other parts of the world. For perspective, pilots in Europe and Canada only have to have 200 or 300 hours before they step into the cockpit. So, what happened next? As expected, the rule added years and tens of thousands of dollars to the process of becoming a pilot in the US. And just months after it went into effect, airlines in the US faced a pilot shortage, leading some to cut routes to smaller airports and even file for bankruptcy. The shortage led airlines to pay pilots higher salaries and ramp up partnerships with flight schools and universities to improve the pathways to the profession. To this day, there's a dispute in the industry over whether the rule has improved safety. As you can imagine, the 1,500-hour rule has remained a sensitive point of contention. When Republicans led an effort to revise it in 2017 to expand service to smaller airports, Democrats quickly shut down the idea.
We're never going to give up. Never. As you never will give up.
Washington left the rule as is, and airlines scrambled to get new candidates in the pipeline. Then came the pandemic, which presented unprecedented challenges for the airline industry. When COVID hit, people stopped traveling altogether, and airlines were incentivized to offer pilots early retirements. That's because in order to take advantage of government aid through the CARES Act, companies weren't allowed to furlough workers. At the 4 biggest US airlines, more than 4,400 pilots opted to depart last year. And when vaccines arrived, we all rushed to snap up our tickets.
As travel takes off again, airlines are scrambling to keep pace with the summer surge.
After crunching the numbers, consulting firm Oliver Wyman says that the US could face a shortage of 7,000 pilots by 2025. To understand how this will impact airlines and all of us travelers, I called a partner at that consulting firm, Jeff Murray, who happens to be a former pilot himself. And if you're retired, you can't come back and get your seniority in your route. Is that right?
That is absolutely right. So the airline pilot profession is a seniority-based profession. They would have to come back as a junior pilot. That means a co-pilot, a first officer, working weekends, earning first officer pay.
Yeah, forget it.
Exactly. No way they're going to come back. Exactly. So it was a really unique challenge that the CARES Act put in place.
As you can imagine, airlines need a huge amount of pilots, and they've embarked on a hiring spree. The big US carriers, Delta, Southwest, United, and American, are on track to hire 13,000 pilots this year and next. But here's the thing. The majors frequently hire from the regionals. These are companies whose official names are Endeavor Air and PSA Airlines, but that commonly fly under names like Delta Connection and American Eagle. And the regionals say they're already experiencing a pilot shortage.
They're the first point of pain with respect to the pilot shortage. So they will feel it first.
This is what a regional airline executive recently said on an earnings call.
The shortages of pilots driven by the federally mandated 1,500-hour rule and now exacerbated by early retirements at the major carriers will require our largest focus over the near term.
And if airlines cannot get the pilots they need, how will travelers, how will all of us consumers feel the effects?
So we're going to see it through reduced schedules. So you're still going to be able to get where you want to go, but you likely won't have the flexibility that you've had historically, and you're probably going to be paying a little more.
Plus, if there's bad weather, Jeff says airlines won't be able to recover as quickly as they usually do since their staffs aren't as big. Okay, so on to the big question. Will the 1,500-hour rule ever change? Everyone I talked to for this story, supporters and critics, say it's unlikely that it will ever just be done away with. But some airline executives hope the FAA could provide more exceptions to it, like allowing highly relevant simulator hours to count toward the 1,500 hours. And they say improving government aid options would help aspiring pilots.
The problem to become a pilot, particularly at the 1,500-hour rule, is you need to spend $150,000, and that's typically not eligible for government loans. So creating ways that they can finance and fund their ability to get the requisite training is really the foundation. And I think it's the only way we're going to solve this problem for small communities, because I expect it's going to get worse before it gets better.
When I reached out to the FAA for comment, they sent me a press release about the rule from 2013. Some believe it would take an act of Congress to make changes. So, do you think Congress and the FAA should revisit the 1,500-hour rule? Drop me a line in the comments below. And if you liked this story and thought it was informative, please hit subscribe so you can join me as I cover more news that's impacting our lives. Safe travels!